This is Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe was born in 1887, and she was one of the early pioneers of abstraction in the early 20th century. She loved nature, and one of the strategies she's best known for is her close up, detailed shots of flowers and other subjects from nature. And she focused on those things so close up that you could only see a few small details, and from that extreme viewpoint it started to look like an abstraction. It became less recognizable, or at least immediately recognizable. Another recurring motif in Georgia O'Keeffe's body of work is the cow skull. Georgia O'Keeffe loved the American Southwest. She loved that desert landscape and spent a good portion of her life in New Mexico. And in that time, she came to appreciate the beauty of not only the flowers and the blooming, but also the cow skulls and sort of that circle of life that we see in nature. And so she painted many cow skulls inspired by that southwestern desert landscape. For this project, we're going to create a cow skull inspired by the style of Georgia O'Keeffe. I'm going to start off by drawing that skull, and when I'm drawing a cow skull, I think of it very similar to the shapes that I'm using for a regular human skull, except it's elongated and sort of it's pinched at the bottom. So it becomes a little bit more like a rounded and sort of organic, but roughly triangular shape. And then I add the eye sockets, the nose, the hole where the nostrils would be. I'm going to add the horns. I add little sort of broken up lines to give a little bit of texture and add some of the contours. Then I start to look at the negative space, and I decided to add sort of flower designs to this to go along with O'Keeffe and that style that she was so known for. I wanted to put in more than one symbol that was characteristic of her style, so I added a couple of big flowers just with overlapping petals in the negative space. And again, I used a little bit of lines, sort of a hatching technique to give it a little bit of texture and depth to it, to give it a little bit of shading on those flower petals. Then after that, in the remaining negative space, I want you to make a variety of patterns. I want you to think about how you can divide it up. Make a couple of stripes across there. I'm making my lines, I'm dividing it into segments that are different thicknesses of bands. So I want to have some thicker stripes, some thinner stripes to add a little bit more variety to it. And you can create any sorts of patterns that you would like. I would encourage you to think about some patterns that are typical of the Southwestern style to go along with the cow skull and the theme and the motif that is common to her work. But I always want you to have freedom to be creative, so think about different ways you can make patterns. I'm using different sizes of triangles in there and filling in those triangles with solid black to make a little bit heavier shapes, and then smaller triangles to add a little bit of variety, and the white space in the negative space around the black also is a triangular design. I want to repeat often similar styles, so I've got lots of zigzag sorts of patterns. I've got square spirals that I'll probably repeat, more traditional rounded spirals in another area. Again, trying to think about that idea of unity within the design. So I want to have elements that are tied together in some fashion, but I also want to create variety at the same time. So I want variations on that theme. So I've got the square spirals that lead then into the rounded spirals, which lead into the wavy lines, which lead into the concentric circles. Again, that idea of variations on a theme. So there's a little bit of unity while it's still having variety to keep it more interesting. Along similar lines, I fill in some of the shapes and thicken some of the lines to get different weights of lines to make it a little bit more visually interesting and make some things stand out a little bit more. Now, after I have made a nice black and white design, I decided to add a little bit of color, and in this case, I'm using watercolor paints. I think it is important to point out that the marker I used initially was a Sharpie. It was a permanent marker, so as I'm painting over it with the watercolor paints, the ink is not smearing. When you are mixing media, it is important to pay attention to what tools and materials you're choosing and think about how those tools and materials will interact. If I had used a Crayola type of marker, a washable marker in the beginning, painting over it with watercolors would not be a good strategy because the ink would smear. Now, after I put in a few dark lines on the cow skull, I then painted over it with just water to spread that ink, or to spread that paint, spread the pigment, and create sort of a gradient to create more natural, softer shadows to let the color fade across. I'm doing something similar on the flowers. I'm using blue and purple in the darkest parts of the flowers, and then I'm painting over it basically with just water on the brush to spread that pigment and thin it out as it goes so that it's a nice smooth transition from the light to the medium to dark on there. Now, for your project, what I want you to do is create a Georgia O'Keeffe inspired piece with a cow skull, and I want you to create a variety of patterns in the negative space around it. I would encourage you to think about ways you can push it further and go above and beyond those minimal requirements. Do things like adding a little bit of value or shading on the skull to give it that sense of volume and make it look like a more three-dimensional form. You could think about incorporating flowers and other symbols into there beyond just the cow skull as a primary focal point.